Again, in the next day and a half, we're going to spend a lot of time looking forward, talking about where we want to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years as it relates to school food and garden-based education. But before we start down that path, we thought we'd spend some time looking backward. And for that reason, we invited Rose Hayden Smith, who is a historian and will be spending some time in the next 20-25 minutes with you all, helping you and me, helping us all understand really where we've been with regard to school food and garden-based education, so that as we look to the future, we have a better sense of both the challenges and the opportunities that might have been reflected in our past as we look to the future. It is my great honor to introduce you to Rose Hayden Smith. Rose Hayden Smith holds an academic position with the University of California Cooperative Extension, where she currently serves as the acting county director. She has worked as a 4-H youth development advisor and master gardener coordinator with the University of California's Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Ventura County since 1992, developing educational programs about agriculture and gardening for youth, educators, and community audiences. She is a 2008-2009 National Food and Society Policy Fellow, a distinction awarded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And Rose Hayden Smith is also, as I mentioned earlier, a practicing U.S. historian and has been an instructor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her work as an historian focuses on gardening, horticulture, and agriculture, especially during the Progressive era and World War I. She focuses on government and educational policies relating to school food and school gardens, the American home front during wartime, women and agriculture, and digital history. She's a nationally recognized expert on the topic of victory gardens and the school gardening movement in America. Please join me in welcoming Rose Hayden Smith.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be with you here. And I like history because it tells us about what the potential is for now. I want to talk a little bit today about what's at stake for us. We need to think bigger. We need to have really large thinking about what is possible in America for food systems, and especially for children and their access to the food system. I want to give you a little brief history of school lunch and school garden programs, case study for World War I and World War II, and give you an idea of what I think may be needed today. Okay. Now, we already know what's at stake. A huge percentage of American children live in poverty, and that number is growing every day because of what's going on economically in this country. There, in the state of Oregon, your wonderful Oregonian paper yesterday said a 10% increase in food stamp recipients in the last year. And poverty affects children inordinately in this nation. And because of poverty is strongly linked with poor dietary practices, and that becomes linked with chronic disease and health issues that impact our nation in enormous ways. And unfortunately, poverty is strongly racialized. And it is a huge problem in this nation. It's been a problem in this nation for a long time. And that is one of the motivators behind school lunch programs. Now, again, one of the motivators is poverty, and the United States became very aware of poverty, more than 100 years ago because of things like photography and muckraking journalists, people like Upton Sinclair, who publicized issues about poverty in America. And there was a wonderful author who wrote a book in 1904 entitled Poverty. And at this time, America was starting to really engage in compulsory education. And what Hunter and other social scientists saw was that kids were not able to learn effectively because they were hungry. So there was a national call to address childhood hunger in America. Now, as we go forward today and tomorrow, what we have to remember is that things have not always been as they are now. Your grandparents didn't have Social Security. That's a relatively new program. This country was fundamentally restructured in terms of public policy 80 years ago. things have not always been as they are now. The same set of assumptions don't necessarily have to apply, and the past has the ability to inform the present. Now, brief history of school lunch programs. In 1853, the first, and I'm always skeptical as an historian of anything that claims to be the first because you can always find another first. But this is widely accepted, and it was a free school lunch program in the United States developed by the Children's Aid Society, which actually also the Children's Aid Society provided the forerunner of foster education and foster care in this nation by sponsoring the first orphan train. Okay, now 1937, the federal government actually started offering hot lunches for 1 million kids through the Works Progress Administration. And that actually is the sort of rationale and the founding block for a lot of our modern commodity-based school lunch program, because America was dumping millions and millions of tons of surplus food, and there were hungry Americans, and so the federal government bought food from farmers to feed hungry children. And that was a pretty ambitious project, 1 million kids. 1946, right at the conclusion of World War II, the government was thinking large, the nation was thinking large, they were concerned about childhood nutrition. And so we got the National School Lunch Act, which was enormous in scope and intent and purpose. One of the reasons that we got that National School Lunch Act was because the draft in World War II, and eventually 10 million Americans were in the service during World War II, revealed that American health was very poor. Because while a draft is a census of male health, by extrapolation it becomes a census of American health. And more than 1 in 5 American men failed the draft exam. So the federal government said, my gosh, we have to have a healthier nation of children, and we're going to have a national school lunch program. Federal government had learned a lot about feeding large groups of people, had very strong ideas. Now, federal lunch program was amended, changed, but in 1967, there was a national nutrition survey conducted that revealed that the gains in the lunch program and nationally, the situation with childhood health was not where it ought to be. And that led to sort of some little New Deal boomlet programs under the Johnson administration. We know them as the Great Society programs, things like WIC in the late 60s, early 70s. And then in the mid-1990s, farm-to-school programs debuted, and they sort of came out at the same time that there was a reemergence of interest in school gardening programs. And they're very, very strongly linked, and they ought to be very strongly linked. We ought to be looking at school nutrition programs and school gardening programs together. Now, the early lunch program goals actually, alleviate hunger wasn't the first priority. It was to prevent vagrancy and juvenile crime and childhood prostitution. Then to alleviate hunger, improve nutrition. There were all sorts of surveys done right around the time of World War I. And, in New York City, 1919, 20% of the kids were hungry and malnourished. Food safety. There were huge issues with food safety during this period. Improve school performance. Americanize immigrant children. Food was seen as a way to Americanize people and as a way for teachers to actually educate mothers and immigrants in best practices. Now, gardening simultaneously actually arose in Europe and Australia. It was compulsory in Prussia in the 1800s, which is kind of not surprising, Prussian compulsory stuff. Very strong history of that. Around the turn of the century, these new educational theories swept the world and the nation, and talking about the value of garden-based learning to teach kids about nature and science. And gardening was seen as a way to teach natural sciences and vocational sciences. And in America, the agenda was largely focused on reform.